Good evening. I'm Nancy West, founder of Indepth NH.org, and I want to welcome you all to the launch of our series on finding a path to sustainable future for journalism in New Hampshire. We need each of you to travel on this journey together with us, and we are off to a bang-up start. We have a special speaker to launch this series tonight, Dan Kennedy, a Northeastern University professor and author. And I've asked a friend of mine, Steve Taylor, who's an independent scholar, farmer, journalist, man about town, if he'd do me the honor of introducing Dan Kennedy. We're both big fans. Steve?
Thank you, Nancy. It gives me honor and thrill to introduce Dan Kennedy, our guest tonight. He's a professor of journalism at Northeastern University in Boston. And before I forget, let me remind everybody who's watching, there are 2 more Zoom sessions in this series on news sustainability. Next Tuesday, on April 12th, and the following Tuesday, the 19th, we are presenting first on this coming Tuesday, Jason Primus, Executive Director of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. And on the 19th of April, we will have Ann Galloway, the founder and editor of VT Digger, and an online news site for the state of Vermont with a $2 million annual budget, staff of 29. The series will be capped off with a special in-person presentation at the Derryfield Restaurant in Manchester, May 4, with our featured speaker, Gloria Norris, author of Cuckoo Land, her memoir, Growing Up in Manchester. To sign up for any of these presentations, please go online to InDepthNH.org and look for the link at the top of the website. Tonight's session, along with the next 2 in the series, are presented free of charge. There is a charge to attend the in-person event at the Derryfield on the 4th. And now about tonight's guest. Dan Kennedy is a professor at Northeastern University School of Journalism in Boston. He specializes in opinion journalism and alternative business models for news. He writes weekly columns on media and politics for the GBH News website and is the author of a book on a new breed of wealthy newspaper owners, Jeff Bezos of the Washington Post and John Henry of the Boston Globe. And his book is titled The Return of the Moguls, How Jeff Bezos and John Henry Are Remaking Newspapers for the 21st Century. His blog, Media Nation, is a nationally recognized source of news and commentary, and he was the media columnist for the late Boston Phoenix, at one time the largest weekly in New England. It unfortunately ceased publication in March of 2013. Continues to work as a media commentator for WGBH News, or as a weekly columnist for the station's website, and a regular panelist on the television program Beat the Press from 1998 until it ceased airing last year. He's also author of The Wired City, Reimagining Journalism and Civic Life in the Post-Newspaper Age, and Little People, Learning How to See the World Through My Daughter's Eyes, a very touching memoir about raising a child with dwarfism. He is the 2018 recipient of the James W. Carey Award for Outstanding Journalism from the Media Ecology Association. We'll have some time at the end of Dan's talk for some questions. We ask that you submit them through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a moderator selecting questions to ask Dan. So please submit them at any time during his talk, and we'll have him answer as many as he's willing. Now, Dan Kennedy.
Well, thank you for that extremely generous introduction, Steve. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for turning out tonight. I'm looking out in the audience, and it looks like all the seats are full. So I'm glad to hear that. What I'm going to be doing tonight is talking about a book that I'm currently working on with Ellen Clegg, who's the retired editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, that has a tentative title of What Works? The Future of Local News. We're looking at a number of independent local and regional news projects around the country that are doing fairly well, growing, and standing as a contrast to corporate-owned chain journalism, which is really just doing terrible things to the media landscape in this country, locally and nationally. So what I want to do is I'm going to frame the issue, try to explain what the problems are, and then show some ways forward. And I'm actually going to do that with the help of a PowerPoint so that you don't have to look at me, and I'll be able to sort of get through that without having to look at any notes or anything. So let me get this up there. This is just a presentation called Breaking Point. Local news is in crisis. What can we do to save it? So we begin by trying to define what the problem is. This is a map that was, by the way, I don't have a clock in front of me and I want to make sure I don't go over. So I do want to get something in front of me so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So bear with me just a second. This is a map that was put together by the University of North Carolina, which has done a lot of good work in tracking what they call news deserts. And a news desert is a term that was borrowed from the term food desert. And just as a food desert is a neighborhood in which there were really no stores, no sources of healthy food, and as a result, people have to, go to the convenience store and load up on sugary soda and Fritos. News deserts are places that do not have a reliable source of local news and information. Now, Penelope Abernathy, who put this map together, relied on counties. And we were talking just before airtime tonight about how counties aren't really a good measure in some places. I know that there is still county government in New Hampshire, but there is no county government in Massachusetts to speak of. Everything is done in the 351 individual cities and towns. So if any one of those municipalities doesn't have a reliable source of local news, we don't know what's going on. And there are some other places that are similar to that. New Jersey, for instance, has 565 municipalities. So trying to count up counties, news deserts by county doesn't really work everywhere, but it's a pretty good indication of what's going on. And you can see that as you get out to the rural heartland in particular, there's a real shortage of news sources. So what happened? The UNC study found that 2,100 newspapers have closed in the last 15 years. That's a lot of newspapers. Many more that are still left are what are sometimes referred to as ghost newspapers or zombie newspapers. And these are newspapers that continue to publish, but they have little or no local news in them. They're full of press releases. They're often full of irrelevant news from other locations in the newspaper chain's empire. We're certainly dealing with that in Massachusetts with the Gannett papers. You get stories from 2, 3, 4 towns over, and they're just of no relevance to us. About 6,000 newspaper journalists have disappeared in the last 3 years alone. These are just jobs that have been eliminated as these corporate newspaper chains try to run their newspapers with as few bodies as they can get away with. And in many cases with fewer bodies than they can really get away with. So what happened? What went wrong? Well, first of all, this is familiar to anybody who works in the news field. Craigslist came along and destroyed classified ads. 40% of newspaper revenues went out the window very quickly because almost all of Craigslist's classifieds are free, and you can't compete with free. Newspapers charged a premium for classified ads. Those are the help wanteds, the houses for sale, page after page of that. I remember the Boston Sunday Globe had so many help wanted ads in it that you needed, two people to pull the paper in off the porch because it was so big and heavy. Those are just gone. I am old enough to have been around at the very beginning of the digital revolution. And I think that newspaper executives at that time were very excited about digital and classifieds. They said, we're going to put them all online. They'll be searchable. They'll provide more value to our audience than we were ever able to do in print. And we're all going to be rich and everyone will be happy forever after. They just never anticipated that somebody was going to come along and give away classifieds. So that proved to be a pretty an impossible situation to deal with. Facebook and Google came along and hurt both digital and print advertising. Google drove the value of digital advertising to the floor and below. So any hopes that we had that advertising on news websites would provide a decent revenue stream really went out the window because Google uses this automated auction system and it just gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. I once heard an explanation that a full page ad in the Los Angeles Times print edition that at one time would have cost $50,000 brings in about $20 to attract the same number of readers on the latimes.com website. So you see a lot of that ad revenue just went out the window. And Facebook is a big part of that too. Very interesting antitrust suit going on right now, charging Google and Facebook with essentially illegal monopolistic practices in destroying the value of advertising. And so we'll have to see how that goes. But one of the things that Ellen and I argue, and we hope to show in our book, is that even though these external problems are very real, the internal problems are every bit as real. And those internal problems are corporate chains and hedge funds came in and bought up so many of our newspapers, cut deeply, way beyond what they needed to make a small profit, and made it impossible to do the kind of innovation that would have been needed to move towards some sort of a future. And, you're all in the Boston Globe circulation area, and probably some of you have subscriptions to the Globe, either in print or digital. You may know that the Globe is a profitable enterprise, and they have a very large newsroom. It's not as large as it used to be, but it's pretty big. And it's because they have a philanthropically minded owner who actually cares about the future of the paper. And he did do some subsidizing of it for some years, but he doesn't subsidize it at this point. It's profitable. Doesn't make a lot of money, but it makes enough. So why does this stuff matter? Well, it matters a great deal. First of all, we live in an age of hyperpolarization. We all know that. We can't even talk to people of the opposite political persuasion about national politics. It's just become a really toxic environment. But on local issues, local news is more trusted, and people are able to work together and just talk more about local issues. There isn't really a Democratic or Republican way to pick up the trash. We all want good schools. We all want an effective police department that also respects people's rights. Now, these have become polarized to some extent as well, but nevertheless, local issues still are a way that we can bring communities together. But if there's no local news to feed that, that doesn't happen. A lack of local news coverage has been shown to lead to more corruption, fewer people running for local office, lower voter turnout. There was a really interesting study done a few years ago that showed that communities that didn't have a reliable source of local news ended up having to pay a higher interest rate when they wanted to borrow money to build, to build a new fire station or whatever. And it's because the people who lend the money were building in essentially a corruption tax. They believe that, well, nobody's really going to be watching the way this money's being spent, so we want a premium in case bad things happen. Democracy really begins at the local level, but it doesn't begin without an informed citizenry. Now, I want to take a look at what I think are the two worst newspaper owners in the country, or at least the two worst chain newspaper owners in the country. I suppose there are still some individual newspaper owners that are pretty bad, but at least they're only doing damage to, 1, 2, or 3 newspapers. Now, the first is Alden Global Capital, which you may have heard about. They recently were the subject of a pretty good report on 60 Minutes. Those people like me who follow this stuff have been writing about Alden for years, but it was great to see 60 Minutes bring this to a wider audience. They're a hedge fund based in New York, and their main group, which is called Media News, owns 100 papers and earns a profit of something like 17%, which is just an astonishing profit in the newspaper business. It's an astonishing profit for a lot of businesses. You go to the supermarket and they're earning, 1 or 2%. So the way that they earn this money is by slashing and burning the newsrooms that they control. Now, New Hampshire is fortunate not to have any newspapers that are owned by Alden Global Capital. In Massachusetts, we have 3. The Lowell Sun, and there's the old Sun building, which is no longer used, the Fitchburg Sentinel and Enterprise, and the Boston Herald. Now, last year, Alden also acquired Tribune Publishing's newspapers. Now, this was fewer papers, but much bigger papers. We're talking about the Chicago Tribune, the New York Daily News, the Orlando Sentinel, closer to home, the Hartford Courant, but 9 major market daily newspapers, the Baltimore Sun. Fortunately, there is a billionaire who lost out on the chance to buy Tribune named Stuart Bainum, who is starting a large digital nonprofit in Baltimore that will serve as good competition to the Baltimore Sun. But they're just acquiring newspapers and squeezing the life out of them across the country. When Alden bought Tribune, they saddled them with a debt financed at 13% interest. And who's lending them the money? Alden is lending them the money. So this is self-dealing on top of squeezing. And they have been cutting their newsrooms at a fearsome rate. The other owner is Gannett. Gannett does have some presence in New Hampshire. The Portsmouth Herald, Foster's Daily Democrat, a few other papers, but they really have a lot of papers in Massachusetts and across the country. 100 dailies. The flagship is USA Today, which I should say is still a pretty good paper. And I want to say 1,000 weeklies, but they have been closing a lot of their weekly papers and going digital only, including in Massachusetts. They're in 43 states. So you're talking about a huge newspaper chain, by far the largest newspaper chain in the country. I don't think they're quite as bottom line oriented as Alden, but they certainly do a lot of cutting. Now, a little bit on how we got here in Eastern Massachusetts, which is a market that, as I said, spills into Southern New Hampshire. Starting about 25 years ago, the community newspapers in Eastern Massachusetts were acquired by Fidelity, the big investment company. And Fidelity thought, we can run all these papers and there'll be economies of scale. And as a result, we'll be able to run them more efficiently and still do a good job of serving the communities. Now, I'm going to give you a tip about following newspaper companies. Many other aspects of the economy. If I just got this message that my AirPods just kicked in for some reason. Can you hear me? I'm going to go to the chat for a moment. Can you hear me? Just type whether you can hear me or not.
You're okay, Dan.
Okay, I'm okay. I'm getting these weird things going on. Okay. So anyway,
Yeah,
Fidelity.
we lost your audio there for a second, but it's back now.
Okay, it's back now. I don't know what's going on, and I apologize. Oh, I think I know what might be happening. So let me try something here. Okay, that might help. Whenever anybody talks about economies of scale, hold onto your wallet and run in the other direction. That's just good advice overall. Anyway, Fidelity really wasn't able to make a go of it. They sold their papers to Pat Purcell when he owned the Boston Herald. He was not able to make a go of it. He sold the papers to a company called Gatehouse, which eventually morphed into Gannett. Gannett's been around for a long time. Gatehouse essentially acquired Gannett and then took the Gannett name. I think it was a little bit of a entering the witness protection program. They also have massive debt, and that means the company has to keep cutting news coverage and closing newspapers. Just recently, we learned in Massachusetts that Gannett is going to close 19 weekly papers serving 26 communities, and they are reassigning almost all of their weekly staff reporters to regional beats. So nobody's really going to be following what's going on at City Hall or Town Hall or the school committee anymore, unless it's part-time stringers. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. I can't emphasize this enough. We can all enjoy a nice lakeside view and get back to the kind of news that we want. Independent news projects are succeeding across the country. Free of debt and locally owned, they focus on serving the community. The challenge is to find ways to encourage more of them. And I'd like to offer a few examples, some of which will be the focus of the book that Ellen Clegg and I are working on. I begin with the New Haven Independent, which is one of my favorite local news projects in the country. This is me with Babs Rawls-Ivy, who is the host of their morning show on WNHH, which is a community radio station that the New Haven Independent started. I wrote about the Independent in my 2013 book, The Wired City. It's online only, it's nonprofit, founded in 2005 and still going strong. They do an absolutely terrific job of covering everything that moves in New Haven. They also cover Hamden. Unfortunately, what we tend to see in this space is that these projects are largely dependent on the vision of a person. And in New Haven, that person is Paul Bass, who is probably the best journalist in the history of New Haven. He spent many years at the New Haven Advocate, which was an alternative weekly in New Haven. I knew of Paul when I was at the Boston Phoenix, and he was a legend then, and he is a legend still. He knows how to raise money, he knows how to do journalism, and they're just doing really well. Now, one of the interesting aspects about the Independent is that New Haven is a largely minority community. A large Hispanic population and a large Black population. Well, the Independent is a partner of La Voz Hispania, which is the Spanish language newspaper in Connecticut. In fact, La Voz is the New Haven Independent's landlord, and the head of La Voz, a woman named Norma Rodriguez Reyes, is the chair of the Independent's nonprofit board. So they do some cross translation, and that's how they. I'm going to have to ask that you hold on for just a second. This is the craziest thing I've ever seen. I apologize for that. Can you hear me? Please tell me if you can hear me.
Yes, can hear you fine.
Okay,
We are
great.
experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by.
Okay, well, that's my fault, not yours. For some reason, the
I can
sound.
hear you. You sound
Okay.
good.
Well, I just put my AirPods in the bathroom because the sound kept trying to default to those. Anyway, when I was writing about the Independent years ago, they had an all-white staff trying to cover this minority community. Now, not only is the staff more diverse, but the radio station has really brought in the community in ways that it hadn't before. And I think that Babs Rawls-Ivy's show is one really good example of that. That brings me to the Colorado Sun. Now, the Colorado Sun was started by 10 journalists at the Denver Post, which had been decimated by Alden Global Capital. The Post is, the Colorado Sun, which is now up to more than 20 journalists, is a different type of business model from the typical nonprofits that we see. The Sun is a public benefit corporation, which means that it's a nonprofit. It's a for-profit corporation, but the charter is written in such a way that they are under no obligation to squeeze out profits in order to enrich their owners. They were able to plow the profits back into their journalism. So that's a really interesting model. They are also doing something that I've seen elsewhere, which is they have a nonprofit arm. And so people and foundations can donate to the nonprofit arm, write it off on their taxes, and that nonprofit helps to fund some of the public interest reporting that they do. Now, the Denver Post still has 60 people. The Colorado Sun only has, 22, 24, but the Post is shrinking, the Sun is growing, and I just think it's a really good and interesting model. I was out in Denver last September reporting on them, and it was pretty interesting to see what they're doing there. The Mendocino Voice, I have a story about the Mendocino Voice. Ellen and I actually started this project a couple of years ago, and I was in Mendocino County to learn about the Mendo Voice during the first week of March 2020. What was going on in the first week of March? Well, we all know, don't we? I was reading the papers that week. Airlines were starting to cancel flights. I was talking to my wife and saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get home. What you're looking at here is the very first coronavirus news conference that was held in Mendocino County. As you can see, we're in a small windowless room. No one's wearing a mask. What did we know? I will say that at that time there had been no reported cases of COVID in Mendo County, but everybody knew it was coming. And the Mendo Voice was covering the news conference, and I was there observing them doing it. Now, why was I following the Mendo Voice? The Mendo Voice is embracing yet another model. They have been a for-profit website since they started about 6 years ago, and they are transitioning to becoming a co-op. And it's a very complicated structure, but what it means is that the employees and readers who are interested in becoming members all essentially have a voice in governing what the Mendo Voice is doing. And I had a conversation just a week or so ago with Kate Maxwell, the publisher of The Voice. We're going to have a longer conversation soon. She did tell me that COVID had been a fairly significant setback to their plans for becoming a co-op. And I'm not really sure where they're at the moment, but hopefully that will happen, because I think it's a promising way to do local news. By the way, I should say, Colorado Sun, online only. Mendo Voice, online only. What you do tend to see in most of these startup local news projects is they just don't want to deal with the expense of print. It just isn't worth it. And if you were a print newspaper trying to reinvent yourself, pretty hard to give up that print product. But if you're starting from scratch, all bets are off, and you can do what makes the most sense for your business. The Bedford Citizen. This is Bedford, Massachusetts, not Bedford, New Hampshire. I know there's a Bedford, New Hampshire as well. This is the smallest project that we're looking at, and the one closest to home. What I love about the Bedford Citizen is that it started as a volunteer project. 3 people from the League of Women Voters 10 years ago were saying, we don't really like the way our Gatehouse Weekly is covering the town. We're going to all these local meetings anyway. Why don't we write them up? We'll start a website. That it started as simply as that. And if you've got 3 people going to the municipal meetings in your community, you can actually do quite a bit of coverage. But what's especially interesting about them is that over the years, they began attracting paid memberships. They began attracting foundation support. They started an annual print product called the Bedford Guide that is loaded with advertising. It's a glossy magazine that comes out once a year. A professional fundraiser who lives in town. She's actually the head of development for the Appalachian Mountain Club, but she volunteered to do fundraising and development for the citizens. So they started raising more money. And now they have a paid part-time reporter. They have a paid full-time editor who, unfortunately, they're paying a part-time salary to. And they pay stringers to cover stories as well. So this is a really interesting example of a nonprofit volunteer project moving into professional journalism. Now, the Citizen was started by young retirees, I would say, people about the age that I am now, frankly. And time passes by. So now you're talking about older retirees, and at some point they're going to want to pass the baton. So they're trying to figure out, has our fundraising reached the point where we can actually hire our next editor as a full-time professional who's making a decent salary? I think they're moving in that direction, and it will be very interesting to see what they are able to do over the next few years. The Provincetown Independent is another startup started a few years ago by an entrepreneur named Ed Miller, who had run several other papers. This is one of the very few print products that I've seen in the startup space. By the way, we're not writing about the Independent in What Works. I should say that there were probably hundreds of projects we could have chosen, and we had to settle on 10. And we didn't want to have too many that were that close to home. But what is so interesting about the Provincetown Independent is that not only do they have a print and digital presence, but if you want to buy a digital-only subscription to the Provincetown Independent, you will actually pay more than if you buy a print subscription that comes with digital as a free add-on. Why do they do that? Well, the reason they do it is because Provincetown is a community that still has a lot of local advertising. And that local advertising is very valuable to the Independent. So what they've said is, if you don't want print, if you just want digital, we're going to charge more because you're not looking at the ads, and we want you to look at the ads. That said, they do get a fair number of digital subscribers because there are a number of people who come to Provincetown in the summer and they don't want print mailed to their house wherever they are, which is probably nowhere near Provincetown. Like the Colorado Sun, they have a nonprofit subsidiary that you can donate to, and that funds certain types of special reporting projects, the environment, LGBTQ issues, housing issues, things like that. I just wanted to mention the Bay State Banner because I think it's a remarkable news organization. It's not a startup, been around for many years, covering the Black community in Boston and beyond. Melvin Miller, the founder, is still the editor. These days, his nephew, Yawu Miller, does most of the work, but they've been a pretty remarkable project over the years. These days, they have a very vibrant website, but they still have a print edition as well. I should say that we have a project at Northeastern called The Scope, which covers social justice issues in Boston. We have a professional editor paid for by a grant, but most of the work is written by our students. And we have a partnership with the Bay State Banner so that they often pick up stories from The Scope, and that gives our students a chance to be published in a professional news outlet. Not the only one that our students are published in by any means, but the Banner is a particularly good partnership that we're very proud of. And finally, last, but absolutely by no means least, is the host of our show, InDepthNH.org, started by veteran journalist Nancy West, who would work for the, I guess what they call the New Hampshire Union Leader for many years, but we all knew it as the Manchester Union Leader. Founded in 2015, covers politics and public policy in New Hampshire. Accountability journalism that's free to all and is supported by its members. I should back up for a moment and say that many of the projects that I'm looking at are either free or have a significant free component. I think the Provincetown Independent is the only one that I'm talking about here that is almost entirely paid. The Colorado Sun has an interesting model where the website is free, but they do some important journalism in their newsletters, and you have to become a paid member to become to get their newsletters. You know, I am totally in favor of news organizations having paywalls if they can support that. I think that especially in an age where advertising is on the decline, it's important that many of these news organizations ask their readers to pay for their journalism. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely crucial that we continue to have free, reliable sources of news and information. And those sources aren't going to exist unless people are willing to support them. And I think InDepthNH.org is a prime example of that. So what are some possible solutions to this? One of the things that we could do is we could require Facebook and Google to pay for news, as they've done in Australia. There's currently legislation that Senator Amy Klobuchar is supporting that would allow the news business to bargain collectively with Google and Facebook to see if they can cut a deal. I have to tell you, I'm not crazy about this. I think there's been some problems in Australia. Most of the money that's been raised has gone to line the pockets of Rupert Murdoch, who still controls much of the press in that country. I'm not crazy about it, but it is an idea that is sort of on the table. Another proposal would allow people to write off up to $250 in news subscriptions on their taxes. And it would also provide tax incentives for publishers to hire and retain journalists and to advertisers to buy ads in local news outlets. I think this has some promise. If it is implemented the way it's been written, it would only last for 5 years. So it seems like it might be worth doing for 5 years to see what happens. The problem, of course, is that it would benefit newspapers owned by the giant chains just as much as it would independent local news projects. That might be a worthwhile price to pay to try to give a boost to some of these projects. I don't know what the prospects are for this. Rick Edmonds, who follows the business of news for the Poynter Institute, wrote a piece just last week saying it looks like this effort is pretty much dead. So I don't know what's going to happen. Tax incentives and disincentives might be implemented to encourage independent local ownership. You could build in some incentives that would try to entice Alden and Gannett into selling their papers and make it painful for them if there's a legitimate buyer and they refuse to sell. I don't know exactly how that would work, but it's an idea that has been out there. I know that Steve Waldman of Report for America and a number of other news organizations has talked about this. And finally, there's the idea of direct government assistance. New Jersey's experimenting with this. I just got back from a reporting trip to New Jersey. I might have mentioned that already, I'm not sure. They have something called the Civic Information Consortium, where taxpayer money is awarded to different types of local news projects to give them a boost. They started at $500,000 last year. It's $1 million next year. And Governor Murphy has proposed $2 million for next year. I don't know that I even have to go into the potential problems that might result from the direct government funding of news. We can talk about more in the Q&A if you'd like. I think some of the problems are obvious, but some people I really respect also think that it's worth giving a try. Sometimes I talk about the Massachusetts Local News Commission. I'm not going to do that today because I think this is largely a New Hampshire crowd, and we're still waiting for the News Commission to get off the ground. So I am actually going to end it right there. I'm going to stop share and come back to you. So thank you for your attention to that. And I would love to know what's on your mind.
Dan, this is Nancy West. Fabulous, fabulous. I study this daily and learn so much from what you just explained tonight. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. And if anyone else would like to ask a question, please write them down in the chat and we'll try to get them. This is from Don Crease. He says, how about reader-owned, democratically controlled news organizations? Giving the example as advocated by the Banyan Project. Why depend on beneficent owners like Mr. Henry or Mr. Sulzberg?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. It's a great question. And first of all, I would say, I don't think there's any one size fits all solution to any of this. I think that what John and Linda Henry have done with the Boston Globe has been of great benefit to all of us. But I like the idea of what you're talking about is a co-op. And I like the idea. I actually spent many years following the Banyan Project's efforts to launch a news co-op in Haverhill. It was going to be called Haverhill Matters. They had a board, they had a fundraising campaign. They never got off the ground. Launching a co-op is pretty difficult. There are a lot of legal hurdles, probably more legal hurdles than there needs to be. But sadly, because I really wanted to see how it would work, it did not succeed in Haverhill. Now, to go back to some of the projects I'm looking at, the Mendocino Voice is in the process of trying to make the transition from a for-profit to a co-op. So that would be what you're talking about. And again, I hope they're able to do it. The last conversation I had with the publisher makes me think that she's put it on the back burner for now. There are very, very few examples, if any, of media co-ops. And there must be something about it that just makes it especially difficult to do. There was one in Akron, Ohio, called the Devil Strip, In Ohio lingo, the devil strip is the grass that you see between the sidewalk and the street. So they called it the devil strip. And they were, for a while, an example of a successful co-op. And they went into complete meltdown last fall, and now the devil strip no longer exists. So I guess what I would say is, great idea. I would love to see somebody do it successfully. Hasn't really happened yet.
Terrific. Dan, I have another question from one of our listeners tonight. What do you think of investor-owned newspapers seeking donations from readers, often hiding behind a fiscal sponsor for tax-deductible purposes? We're seeing that here in New Hampshire.
You know, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the question, and I wonder if the person asking the question could provide some specifics, because I'm not quite sure what the question is.
I think what he's getting at is investor-owned newspapers, for-profit newspapers, seeking donations as a 501c3. I've seen it in New Hampshire as well.
Well, if they're
I was reading this.
If they're a 501c3, I'm not sure how they can be investor owned.
Well, we have for-profit newspapers who work with a 501c3 nonprofit, and that money is funneled through the 501c3 for projects to be used by a for-profit newspaper. That's becoming fairly common.
Yes, okay. Of course, the Colorado Sun, the Provincetown Independent. I think, even the Boston Globe has funded some of its education reporting through foundation money. I think that's a good idea as long as the money is spent properly and the reporting projects that it's funding are worthwhile. I think that what I would say is that these for-profit news organizations, nobody's getting rich these days, that's for sure. I guess I would have a problem if a Gannett-owned paper were doing this, or an Alden-owned paper were doing this. But if you have a locally owned for-profit news organization that is probably struggling to get by, I don't think it's a bad idea to have a nonprofit arm in order to bolster some of their public interest journalism. And, if the questioner has some specific abuse in mind, I guess I would say that, yeah, I could imagine situations where there could be abuses, but as a general philosophy, I don't have a problem with it.
Dan, you're close to this next question. What are today's journalism students saying about community journalism and their future in it?
Well, what I tell my students and what I hear from them, but I think that they need to have some perspective, because I'm not sure they always realize this. It's always been hard. When I was breaking in 100 years ago, it was hard. It's harder now. There's no question about it. But there are ways in. And our students often do find ways in. Now, unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer opportunities in community journalism. I look at all of these cuts that Gannett has made. Well, for a lot of our students, their first job after graduation was to work for one of these Gannett papers for a year or two, and then try to look for something that paid a little better. And now even those jobs are disappearing. But we have recent graduates working at places like Politico and traditional news jobs. We have to students who were much better than I ever was or will be at places like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. They seem to find a way to do it. I'll tell you a story about a former student of mine. Now I'm guessing that she's probably around 30 now, so she's not a super recent graduate. A couple of years ago, she was more than a couple of years ago, she wanted to meet me for coffee because she felt like she wasn't getting anywhere. She was working at these small lifestyle magazines in the Cambridge, Somerville area that really weren't paying her enough to make a living. And so she wanted to know what I thought. Well, before you knew it, she had a chance to become the food writer at the Minneapolis City Pages, which is an alternative weekly. She rose to become their editor-in-chief, the first female editor-in-chief they ever had. Sadly, they went out of business a couple of years ago. Most alternative weeklies have gone out of business, including the Boston Phoenix, the one I work for. Now, she is involved in a startup alternative website called Racket in Minneapolis. So she is still plugging away and still doing the best she can to find her way in journalism. Her name is M. Castle, and she was the guest this week on our podcast, What Works, the one that just went up earlier today. So give her a listen if you get a chance.
Will do. Here's another question from Don Crease. Why not just use public radio as the model? It has been the journalism success story of our era.
Great idea. I think that what you find with small nonprofit news websites like the New Haven Independent, like Indepth NH.org, they are using the public radio model. They ask for voluntary memberships. They get foundation money, they get grant money, and that's how they go about and do their work. Now, another way of looking at that question, and I'm not sure if this is what you had in mind, is why don't public radio stations just step up and fill the gap? Well, by their nature, they are regional. Public radio stations are not local. They are regional, and they do wonderful work covering the area. We have two of them in Boston, WBUR and GBH, which I'm affiliated with. Terrific regional coverage of Boston and the towns around it, but they can't cover, select board, city council, school committee, things like that. It's way beyond what they're able to do. But yeah, I mean, I think that the public radio model adapted for hyperlocal news is one of the more successful models out there. I'm glad that not all of the local startups are nonprofit. I think we need a variety of models, but many of them are nonprofit, and I think many of the most successful ones are nonprofit.
Dan, thank you so much. This has really been illuminating tonight. And you've touched on this. Part of what is making these startups work is volunteers, is people. We had a big fundraiser in November and December and got hundreds and hundreds of small donations, some big donations. And it was just wonderful. And there's a large organization called Newsmatch through Institute for Nonprofit News that matched all of those small donors. And I agree with you. The more models that we can examine and find out what's working in different areas. And I'm sure you've looked into the Vermont Digger, founded by Ann Galloway. She's going to be one of our speakers in the third session for Zoom session. But I just can't thank you enough. People like you stepping up to the plate, studying the problem, looking for solutions, and helping tiny, small news outlets like InDepthNH.org. It's, I can't tell you how much it's appreciated and how much I learned from you. I read Media Nation almost as fanatically as Steve Taylor does.
Well, thank you. I should say that Anne Galloway does a cameo in my book, The Return of the Moguls. I have a little bit of a Vermont digression in there, and I had a chance to drop in on VT Digger and interview Anne and some of the other people up there. And next week, Jason Pramis, he's terrific. He'll give a terrific talk. You know, we talk about the Boston Phoenix being no more. Well, Boston still has an alternative weekly, Dig Boston. And that is because of a really interesting business model that they have that's similar to some of the other ones that they talked about. The Boston Institute for Nonprofit News, which is affiliated with Dig Boston, publishes in-depth journalism on their own, but a lot of it also appears in the Dig. So I'm sure he'll be talking about that next week.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much, everybody on this call. We'll have a story at InDepthNH.org with links to the different podcasts and websites that people can go to see and learn more about Dan Kennedy. I'm just thrilled that you could come tonight. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And good luck on the program. I think it's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Thank you, everybody.